Um, okay, and I was there for a little bit after that. I'm really happy to be here. I think it's a great conference to think about the future, think about 21st century. I think it's really good for people to get together and think about what's going on, just to, catch up, to think a little bit ahead about where we are. And one of the things I want to do today is just to perhaps just to get us thinking about where we are individually in our own experiences and where we would like to be going. We all different. We all have different experiences. We come from different settings, different places, and so there's no formula for the way these trends in TESOL are happening. There's no one way. There's no formula. There's no prescriptions. Things are different for every one of us. We all have our stories. We all have our different goals for professional development. We have our different goals for our learners or for the teachers we're working with. So I'm just hoping that what I can do today is throw out some ideas based on my own experience, on my own research, that may get you to think a little bit about, where you are, where you work, the type of work you're doing, your experiences, where you come from, where you want to go, and try and relate it to your own working context. I'm going to try and see if I can share my screen here in some successful sort of way. I hope you can see that. So I've got a very sort of general topic, communicating identities in the classroom. I've got that part of the topic because I want to show you some activities from a book that I recently published, which actually brings the idea of identity into the classroom. And there have been calls for that for some time. There's been a lot of research and a lot of discussion about identity and how important it is. But it's always been out there somewhere, theoretical or empirical research. So what this book tried to do was to bring it into the language classroom. And I'll show you one or two examples of activities that you can use in the classroom. Then I want to just talk a little bit more about identities sort of generally. So if I can just get my screen to move on. So I want to start off by talking about what identity means, particularly for you. I'll talk a little bit theoretically about identity, which is one of the trends at the moment and has been for a number of years in applied linguistics at TESOL. So I want to show you why I think it's one of the trends. But I don't just want to talk theoretically. As I said, I want to try and bring it into the classroom. And I want you to reflect on what identity means for you and for your practice in your context, right? And I'll start off by looking at language learner identity, particularly in SLA, because one of the early big names in identity was Bonnie Norton or Bonnie Norton Pierce. And I'll just show you how her work emerged in the late 20th century. And then I'll show you some examples from that book I mentioned, Communicating Identities in Your Classroom. I'll show you some examples, see if you think they would work in your classroom or not. And attached to these activities in the classroom are some teacher reflections, where teachers can start to reflect on their identities. And so there's been a move in recent years to looking not only at learner identities, but teacher identities as well. And that has really taken off as a trend in TESOL. Just getting back to the theme of the conference, right? As you can see on the top of the screen, TESOL in the 21st century, recent trends, research and practices. That's the theme of the conference. So I don't want to move away from that. I think let's stick to that. And my focus is on identity as part of these trends, research and practices. I want to also look at teacher researcher identity. There's a very strong movement around the world of how teachers are getting involved in research. And I'll show you a study I was involved in for some time at teachers who embarked on a PhD journey in order, of course, to get the qualification. But this also meant that they were going to be engaging in research seriously, for many of them for the first time. And I was interested in how this was going to change their identities as teachers or as teacher educators. So I'll show you some of that research as well. Okay, so I will then also look at some of the dilemmas this, of course, introduces into the lives of teachers when when they have a teacher identity and a researcher identity, and how these start to, interact and perhaps cause some sort of identity dilemmas in their life. So depending on how much time we're gone, I'll see how fast I can move. We may be able to get through all of that. Okay, so I hope that sounds fine. Just as I said at the beginning, what I want you to do, and I'll give you moments in this talk for you to sit for 30 seconds and to reflect on what I'm saying, of how what I'm saying relates to you and to your work in your context. So I want it to be particular to your particular work. Otherwise, it's just abstract stuff. So I think it'll be much more useful if what I'm saying, you can relate it to what you're doing in your work, in your practice, in your particular context. Okay, so I'll start off with this definition of identity. It's not sort of a definition, it's a sort of conceptualization of identity from Bonnie Norton. Now, this is from the 2013 book, which is a second edition of a book she published in 2000, which is based on her early work that she published even earlier than that, which I will show you in a few minutes. So here she uses the term identity to reference how a person understands his or her relationship to the world. So that is important, because previously identity was always, connected to the person, him or herself. Whereas what she's doing in her work here is saying that identity relates the person to the world. You look at the person in a particular context, all right, and how that relationship is constructed across time and space. So that relationship is constructed in relationship with other people over time and in different spaces. So you can see when she's talking about identity, it's not only about the person, him or herself, but it's the person in relationship to other people in the world over time and in different spaces, physical spaces and also social spaces, right? And also important in this definition, she goes on, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. So it's not only identities in terms of now, but it's identities in the future as well. So the person, so this implies that, of course, identities can change. Identities can change over time as we interact with other people. The other part of this definition that's important for us as language educators is that she says it is through language that a person negotiates a sense of self within and across different sites, these different spaces at different points in time. Again, that reference to time. Of course, it's through language, but it's also other semiotic resources that we have in our lives. That we've got language, but we've got, look at me using my hands. We've got gestures. We've got facial expressions. But we've got material objects that we use. We've got digital media. We've got, we've got devices. We've got all sorts of things through which we construct our identities. But for us, I guess, as language educators, language is important. And I'm going to come back to that idea in a few minutes because it's really important. So these ideas she first put down in her 1995. So that's a long time ago. This 1995 article, Social Identity, Investment and Language Learning, in the journal TESOL Quarterly. And of course, work was done on identity long before this, where, second language acquisition researchers looked at individual differences, the individual differences of learners, but focusing very much on the learner as individuals. They also looked at learners as members of different groups, different cultural groups, different national groups, but they were very much closed groups, in groups, out groups, whereas Bonnie Norton's work was looking much more at how people in moment to moment, second by second, interrelate with other people and construct their identities in the process. So what she says in that 1995 paper is that the central argument of the paper is that SLA theories have not developed a comprehensive theory of social identity that integrates the language learner and the language learning context. So she wants to move away from this idea of the individual differences, how language learners are just these individual people with a fixed identity attached to them in some way, but rather that we interact, we have relationships with other people. And it's through these relationships over time in different spaces that we are continually constructing our identities. When we have these relationships, of course, this is what she says most powerfully, of course, is that SLA theorists have not questioned how relations of power in the social world affect social interaction between second language learners and target language speakers. So these relationships that language learners have are absolutely connected and infused with relations of power. It's these relations of power that affect the way the identities are constructed. And just one more quote. She says, if learners invest, this idea of investing and investment was a very powerful part of her work. And I'm going to come back to it right at the end of my talk again. She says, if learners invest in a second language, they do so with the understanding that they will acquire a wide range of symbolic, such as language, education, friendship, resources, and also material resources, such as capital goods, real estate, money. These are, the capital things you get. So by learning a language, you invest in that learning, and by investing in it, you want to get something back, right? You put a lot of energy and commitment and work into it, and so you want to get something back, which will in turn increase the value of their cultural capital. So in other words, they will change themselves by learning a language. So you're not only investing in language learning, you're also investing in identity, is the point she's making. So since this work was published in '95, lots of other work and lots of discussions and debates about what identity is has been published, for the past, 25, almost 30 years. So just for example, here's one book, The Complexity of Identity and Interaction in Language Education. This is just one book from 2020, from many books before that. In 2016, there was a special issue of TESOL Quarterly, not on learner identity, but teacher identity. So there was an interesting shift to looking at identity. We're talking about trends, right? So an interesting shift to looking at teacher identity. A year later, in the Modern Language Journal, there was another special issue on language teacher identity, this time looking at a transdisciplinary approach to language teacher identity. Sorry, the focus is not very good here, but it says transdisciplinarity and language teacher identity. Very good articles in there looking at how we can investigate language teacher identity from a transdisciplinary approach, right? And so we go on. This is a book I published, an edited book in 2017 with 30, I think about 30, 40 chapters, short chapters, where I got people from across the globe to reflect on their own lives as researchers, as teachers, and to reflect on their own ideas on what language teacher identity is. So they conceptualize the idea of identity in their own work that they do, whether it's academic writing or curriculum design or material development or study abroad or whatever the case may be. This is an excellent book that came out 2018 looking at social interaction and English language teacher identity. All right, I'm just showing you examples to show there's so much out there now. We're looking at trends. So there's lots of, this is language teacher identity in TESOL, looking at the work that TESOL educators do. This is criticality, teacher identity, and inequity in English language teaching, taking a more sort of critical approach to looking at teacher identity. This is another one, transnational identities and practices. I'm not recommending you read these, by the way. I'm just showing you that, that we're overflowing with all these books and ideas and research that's coming out on identity in our field of TESOL. And this is one that I recently published on language teacher educator identity. So it's looking I think for the first time really, what the language teacher educators do, the work that they do, and also how this work relates to their identities that they construct in their work as they interact with the teachers that they work with. And I'm going to show you some research that I published in this short book a little bit later. So just going back to Norton's ideas, when we, her ideas about language teaching and learning and identity, she says that when learners invest in language learning, they expect some yield, right? Remember, she used the word capital. They want something in return, right? So investment relates to the futures that learners imagine for themselves. So you spend time working, committed to language learning. You want to get something back, right? So this is your investment in language learning. So investing in language learning, it means investing in their identities. So it changes who they are. They change who they are, our language learners, by learning language. We all know that, right? I'm just saying it again for you. So it makes sense, therefore, that identity should be the focus in the classroom. There have been endless calls for language learners to pay attention to their changing identities, to reflect on their identities that change as they're learning the language, to become aware of these changes, to question them. Why is my identity changing in such a way? Who's responsible for it? And is it me? And they explore these changing identities. They contest them. They may not be happy with them. Maybe inside themselves, they may experience dilemmas in their changing identities. So there's been a call for teachers and learners to explore these identities and these changing identities in the classroom, right? As part of the English teaching or the language teaching that takes place, the activities that take place in the classroom. So one of my colleagues, Pat Strauss, and I, we decided to put some activities together in this book that enable teachers to use these activities to explore identity in the language classroom. So what the book has is 48 different, well, there's an introductory chapter which gives an overview of identity, very much like I've just given you now so far. There's also a chapter towards the end, which is a chapter which gives a broad overview of how teachers could use exploratory action research to explore identities in the classroom. But the body of the book...
for the course of...
The body of the book, the core of the book, are these 48 activities, communicative activities that are focused on learner identity. And just before I show you one or two of those activities, I just want to show you how we structured the book. It's divided into 4 sections, 4 different facets of identity. The first of these is what we call reflexing identities. This is who we think we are, the self's view of the self, the inner self. So, this is me, Gary, how I reflexively think about my own identity, my view of myself. So, learners may see themselves as language user or language learner, their self-concept of who they are as learners. And teachers may, see that their own ideas about their self-efficacy, their role, their status, and so on. So these are the reflexive. You see this little person here, reflexive, this arrow looking inwards. Okay, so reflexive identities. But of course, identities is not only thinking about ourselves, but also we project our identities. So the second part of the book are 12 activities where the learners and the teachers work together on activities focused on projecting identity, how we want others to see us. This is the public representation of the outer self, these sort of multiple, and they're variable, of course, as I said early on at the beginning. So using language and other semiotic resources, as I mentioned earlier, dress, gesture, appearance, all these different ways in which we project our identities. And there are lots of examples in the activities. in which the learners get to reflect on these different type of resources and how they can be used to project identities. I won't go through these examples, but learners can project their language proficiency and their motivation, and that can be observed, and teachers can project their classroom practice. These are sort of observed, of course, and when I say observed, this is the recognizing identity, so how others see us. So we see ourselves reflecting identities, then we project our identities, and then those are recognized by others. So how others see us, it's the counterpart of the projected identities. So these are how those projected identities are understood and acted upon by others. Identities, of course, could also be ascribed or attributed to us, even though we don't like them, right? And these are often, contested by us, particularly if it's an identity that's sort of, dumped on us and we don't particularly like it. All right, so as you can see from the little diagram here, these are identities that go the other way. They're recognized by others. And then the last part of the book is imagining identity, how we imagine ourselves in other times or other places, in other social spaces, for example, participating in imagined communities. So it's thinking about ourselves, imagining, reflecting on ourselves and who we are in other places, in other times, with other people, and so on. And these could also include future selves or ideal selves, that some of you may be familiar with some of that literature as well. And then what we do with all of the activities, we make reference to these different identity categories and resources, which are these culturally embedded terms that we use to talk about identity, labeled quite simply things like our religious identity, cultural identity, gender, age, ethnicity, and so on. Of course, these are all interrelated and very messy and mixed up, but just for the sake of designing the activities and giving them a topic, we use these labels, these sort of identity categories in each of the activities. So I'll just show you a couple of examples of how identity can be the focus of communicative language activities in the classroom. That's the point of this part of my presentation. So have a look at this one. This is activity 1, the very first activity in the book. I'll just go through it a little bit slowly, and then I'll show you one more activity, and I can zip through that one. So students so each activity has a little introduction. It's got some information about the aim and so on, and what the language skills or the focus of the language are in the activity. So students usually have access to a course book or textbook in their language course, whether it's hard copy or electronic. This short activity asks students to flip through their course book for a few minutes to examine images or any other diagrams, words, keywords, figures, and so on that may or may not reflect how they see themselves, their identities, in other words. So students write down why this is the case and share their responses in pairs. So it's just a little introduction to what happens. So this activity could serve as a warm-up activity at the start of the unit. And this just tells you what you need. The students need a course book, or if they don't have any, you can bring in magazines or newspapers, or sort of preferably what they use in their courses. I think makes it more relevant. And then what happens, there are a list of procedures that's made available to the teachers or the students as well, if they have it. Ask students to take out their course book or textbook or log into an online learning platform if that's what they use, and give students about 10 minutes to page through the course book, and students then pick out 5 images, which could be of people or animals or objects, and may consist of photos, drawings, diagrams, figures, keywords, shapes, colors, whatever the case may be. And for each of the 5 images, the students write down the page number and then complete the sentence, writing it next to the page number. This is like me because, right? And you can see it's relating to the learner. It's reflexive identity. So it's what the learner thinks about him or herself. So provide the student with an example or two, the teacher, just to give them an idea of what to do. So the teacher may say, there's a picture of a woman. This is like me because I am female. A photograph of a cow in the field. This is like me because the grass is green and I like nature and I want to save the planet. an advertisement of a new car. This is like me because I plan to be a mechanic one day. Just a couple of examples. Then the second part of the activity, students find another 5 items and they say, this is not like me because, and they do the same thing. They write their 5 sentences. And then they get into pairs and then they share with each other their an image that they've chosen. And then the other person's got to say if they think it's like them or not like them and give a reason. Very simple, elementary activity. So when the students have had a few turns, back and forth, they stop the pair work, and then the teacher has a discussion about what just took place. And at this point, the teacher can say why. The teacher can say what they mean by identity. Remember, this is the first activity, and so on. As I said earlier on, at the end of each activity, there's a teacher reflection, which may also prompt some ideas for teacher research. So, for example, in that first activity, for the teacher this time, next time you flip through the materials and documents you come across in your professional life, think about how the images, keywords, and diagrams reflect how you see yourself as a teacher, administrator, or researcher. Such materials may include, your course book, syllabus documents, policy statements, institutional Facebook pages, and so on. So these are some documents or resources that the teacher may come across him or herself, and then they reflect on how does this relate to me as a teacher, to who I see myself? Important here is there some sort of research topic, a teacher research topic available or that could come out of this teacher reflection? Okay, I'll show you another one. I won't go through this one in as much detail, but this one is in the second part of the book, projecting identities. And here, the topic is justifying your opinion. So in this activity, it refers to an earlier one, which is called Chickens in Cages, where students were asked to identify the pros and cons of caged poultry farming, where students, had to make decisions about the do's and the pros and the cons of this form of chicken farming, I guess. In this activity, they've got to say which side of the argument they agree with and why, and then they've got to write a short piece. As you can see down number 3, students will then be required to write a short opinion piece, 4,500 words for a local newspaper, explaining why they believe caged farming of chickens should or should not be allowed. So this is a more advanced activity, also communicative in the sense that it's writing a sort of functional piece for a local newspaper or a web page, it could be, or whatever the case may be. But this time it's projecting identities. And then there's a related, once again, a teacher reflection. Students do not always feel comfortable expressing their opinions about certain issues in the classroom because it will reveal too much about what kind of person they are, right? Their identities. The issue can be controversial and the opinions contested, which could cause students to feel threatened. Do you strive to create a safe space for your students to express their opinions? How do you achieve this? So this is the teacher reflection, right? Are they able to be who they want to be? What boundaries should you set? Are there topics or issues that you do not allow to be discussed in your classroom? Do you feel free to express your own opinions about controversial matters? What limits do you set yourself? So reflection about, how much debate, discussion, conversation about about potentially controversial issues do you allow in your own teaching? So for each of the learner identity related issues, activities that take place in the classroom, there's a short reflection for the teacher to think about her or his own, developing professional identity as well. And there are others as well. There's one here where the learners have to think about national identity and question the idea of a national identity. That's the whole activity. And then for the teachers, what they do is this reflection might be useful before the activity, but it can also be done afterwards. What country or countries are you from? Do you represent your country when you teach? And if so, how do you do that? What do your students think about your country? Are they from the same country as you? And so on. They, take a moment to represent yourself or on one of the outline figures, because the students do that in the activity. They get an outline figure and they try and represent their country, or they question their nation or their nationality in some way on these figures. And this is for the teachers to do. Would you be prepared to show it to one of your colleagues, for example? Here's just the final one I thought I'd show you. When you play games on the computer, you get a name, and the whole activity is about the names, the gamer names that students would, give themselves if they do play games, because these names are very much related to who they are in this gaming world. And this is about, if teachers had to be given a name, or if they chose a name themselves, what name would they choose? And once again, are there any research topics here? Because what I want to talk about next are teachers as researchers, and how teacher identities sometimes change when they take up a research activity in their classes. Okay, so teachers as researchers. When we talk about teacher research, who do we mean when we talk about teacher researchers? In high schools or primary schools, higher education, universities, private language institutes, community language schools, who do we mean by teacher researchers? So when I'm talking about teacher research, I want to go back to what I said right at the beginning. I'm not talking about any one type of teacher or any one type of teacher researcher. There are possibilities around the world, right? So who are you as a teacher researcher? Even if you're not one, who would you like to be as a teacher researcher? What identity would you imagine for yourself, or do you have as a teacher researcher? Remember, we're talking about identity today. So different types of teacher researchers. Where are teacher researchers? In the global north or the global south, right? They're different. Those have different implications for how we conceptualize research. The type of work teacher researchers would do, what we understand by teacher researchers, where they are located, not only physically, but also ideologically in the global north and the global south. We mean different things by teachers and researchers and teacher researchers in these different ideological spaces, right? In rural and urban settings, we have different resources available in these settings, and so if teachers want to get engaged in research or with research, they may not have the resources available that some teachers in other settings may have. So in other words, we have well-resourced and teacher researchers in difficult circumstances. Some teachers are supported. Their schools may give them time or funding or facilities or equipment. Other schools, that may not even be an option at all. So, where are you? Think about you. If you are doing research or want to do research or imagining one day doing research as a teacher, where are you? Where are you located? What opportunities do you have? Or did you have, or would you like to have, right? So when we talk about teacher research, we're not talking about, some ideal teacher researcher. We're talking about an infinite variety of people, of teachers who may or may not have opportunities to do research, who may or may not be supported to do research. So I just want to make sure that when I'm talking, that you understand when I'm talking about a teacher researcher identity, there's no one thing. It's not one thing. They are varied. And also when we're doing research, what type of research are we talking about? Action research, so-called academic research that get published in the top journals, or exploratory practice or exploratory action research, or narrative inquiry, where we share stories and co-construct stories and tell stories. And then, the very sort of conventional methods, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. What do you do when you do research, or what would you like to do when you do research? So again, as teacher researchers, when we talk about the types of research we'd like to do, it relates to our identities. I mean, I see myself very much as a qualitative narrative inquirer, and that's part of my identity as a teacher researcher, right? And then finally, talking about teacher research, what's your motivation? Why do you do it? Or why would you like to do it? Is it part of your institutional contractual obligations? Is it something you have to do because it's part of your contract? I mean, where I work at my university, I have to do research. It's part of my employment agreement. I'm required to do research for a certain percentage of my time. Or do you do research or would like to do research just, on your own accord because it's something you'd like to do? Are you part of a community of practice, or would you like to share your findings? Is that something you'd like to do, to go to a conference like this one and share your findings, or to go to workshops, or to go to, to publish in a newsletter? Are those your goals? Or is it part of a qualification? Are you, engaged in an undergraduate research course or a graduate course where you need to do research or want to do research as part of a qualification? So, what's your motivation for doing research, and how does that relate to you as a teacher, to your identity as a teacher researcher? Okay, so what I want to do is have a look at some of these options in these last 4 slides, these blue slides. Who are you, where are you, what do you do? These slides, and I want to address some of those questions in the study, and I'll do this quite quickly. In the study that I did in South America, in Colombia, at a public university, where there were a group of students, a cohort of PhD students who started together. These were very experienced English teachers. They'd been teaching for many years. They were also teacher educators, but early career researchers. They hadn't done that much research. They had done sort of action research, or they'd done research as part of their master's or their undergraduate studies, but not much experience in published research. So I was interested in how their identities were going to change by becoming PhD students in this particular program. They all started together. And I was interested in looking at the negotiation of their teacher and teacher educator identities in a PhD program, paying particular attention to their researcher identity and to their emotions, how their emotions related to their identities. Soon after I started, it became clear that the teachers had a very strong moral stance about teaching, about English teaching in Colombia, about education, about research. And so this became a focus of the research as well. So when I was looking at their identities, I had to it was unavoidable. I needed to pay attention to, what they believed was right and wrong, and what they believed was just, and needed to change, and right needed to change, and so on. So moral stance became important in their developing identities as teachers. So I won't go into details here, but I conducted 2 interviews a few months apart, and the interviews were very much biographical, looking at their personal biographies of being teachers, of being teacher educators, their PhD journey, and their goals for the future, particularly their research goals, because many of them wanted to embark on a PhD so that they could do research about particular topics that interested them. They had strong commitments to wanting to discover particular sort of topics in their lives as practitioners, right? Okay, so I'll start. This is one of the teacher educators, one of the teachers. Her name is Anna, and she's many years teaching experience. She actually taught a bit overseas as well, and she had a number of different jobs, but she desired to get a full-time university job as a teacher, as a researcher in a full-time post at a university. And she tells this story. It's a longer story. I'm just showing you a little bit of the story. She tells the story where they opened up, they advertised some university jobs at this university. She says, well, they opened some posts and I wanted to apply. She wanted to apply for it. And then they said that I was not prepared. So just have a look at the words in red. It's very much they and I. She set up this conflict between them at the university and them at the university and I, who's Anna, who is telling the story, right? So they and I, there's conflict going on here. They represent the university, and I, who is Anna, who's wanting a job at that university. She said, and I would apply for it, but they said that I was not prepared. I mean, I was not prepared because I didn't have research, because I didn't have this and that, because your research because your only piece of research is the one that you did for your master's. Well, okay, it's not enough. And I was like, oh, so I'm not enough? What I have done is not enough? And I said, oh, look at the emotion. And I said, oh, you can see she's angry here, right? Oh, I'm not enough. So I was thinking, maybe I should do a PhD. So now this is the reason why she decided to do a PhD, so she could get some more research experience. Because like having a master's will never be enough. If I want to work in a full-time position in a university, that's her desire here, a full-time position in a university. So a very powerful story where we've got the characters in the story, Anna and the people at the university, the people who have the power, the ones who can decide if she gets the job. Those people believe that she does not have the proper qualifications. She does not have the research. Her identity as a researcher is the wrong type of identity for that particular position that they are wanting to fill at the university. She's not happy about that. She says, I am not enough. Meanwhile, she's a brilliant teacher. She's got years of teaching experience. She's a teacher educator. She has supervised students' action research at university. She's very well qualified from her perspective. We'll hear more about Anna much later. If I'm looking up there, my clock's up on the wall, if I've got time. So when I was looking at her story, what she was telling me was her reasons for doing research, or for her continuing professional development, or her further in-service teacher education. So what I did was I tried to relate her reasons for doing a PhD to her identity changes. And I thought an interesting way to connect it was that idea of investment. Remember right at the beginning, I spoke about Bonnie Norton's idea of investment, investing in language learning. Here we've got investing in research learning, investing in further development, professional development, investing in further in-service teacher education. So she wanted to invest in a researcher identity by doing a PhD. So again, just looking at the story, just to remind you, they advertised some posts. Line 1, the people in power at the university, line 3, said she was not prepared. Why? Line 4, I didn't have research. She didn't have this and that, the things they wanted. She only had one piece of research from their perspective, but it was what she did in her master's degree. Not enough from the university perspective. So my reason then, what I've got to do, I've got to do a PhD. Why? So I can get a full-time job at a university. So this is expressing her desire for her imagined identity, which is to have a full-time position at a university. That's her imagined identity that she desired. But she was prevented from achieving that identity because the people in power at the university said she was not good enough. So her reason for doing a PhD was to develop. So I put this arrow going through my diagram. I don't know, it's just a diagram. Don't get excited. It's just this diagram with the reasons connecting to identity. And I think investment is one way of making that connection. And I think that runs through this diagram, this idea of development, professional development. For Anna, it's research-focused development. She wants to develop her research, but it's also personal development, by getting the job by doing the PhD, she's going to be developing herself as well. There's going to be an aspect of her personal development here as well. So here we've got, just going back to the arrows, research-focused development and personal-focused development. Okay. Here's another story. I'm not going to go over the story because I'm just a bit aware of time, but this is another teacher. This is Alex. I won't read it, but what Alex says here, this is Alex who teaches a course on curriculum design. He teaches a module on curriculum design. But he became aware, so this module he teaches are to future teachers. He's a teacher educator. But he became aware that that the course he teaches is quite superficial. It's very elementary. What he does is it's just about what curriculum is. But he feels he needs to go further in his course. But to go further, he needs to develop his own understanding, of the epistemological background to curriculum and the different pedagogical positions in curriculum. So he needs more academic information, more theory about curriculum in order to be able to teach his future teachers more effectively. So he's had this group of teachers for these semesters, but the teachers, they don't have this background because I can't give it to them. So what I better do is I better go and start looking for a PhD. So with Alex, his development is practice focused in terms of his teacher education practice. He wants to be able to make sure his curriculum module is a much better module for the sake of his students. So he's also student teacher focused. His development is directed, focused towards the development of his student teachers. It's also academic focused. He wants to learn much more about what curriculum is and what the pedagogical implications are, and the what is the other one? The epistemological positions are related to curriculum. So these different developments related to Alex are practice related, student teacher related, and academic related. So these are these 5 different developments that I discovered. I looked at all 7 participants, of course, in the study. I'm just showing you a little sample here. I looked at all seven participants, and I looked at their reasons for investing in this further professional development, in wanting to learn about research, embark on their PhD dissertations and theses so that they could learn about research. And what I did was simply say that these reasons related to their investing in developing their professional identities in these 5 different ways. I'm sure there are other ways as well, but it relates to their teacher researcher identity, right? So just think for 30 seconds while I have a sip of water. For 30 seconds, what is your development? What are you involved in at the moment? Are you a student? Are you a teacher? Are you a teacher educator? How are you developing your identity as a researcher and as a teacher? Okay, just for the last few minutes, I just want to go back to Anna again. She was the one who didn't get the job at the university and was quite emotional about it, right? So I'll just want to finish off Anna's case, and then that will be all from me. So with Anna, she experienced very much an identity dilemma in her desiring to be a researcher, but also to continue to be a teacher. So this is a story that she tells that exposes this identity dilemma in her life. So I'll just read it for you. Just pay attention to the words that are in red. She said, but I would love to carry out research. She really is committed to doing research. But what I don't like is the system in which the research should be like this and like that. And you have to publish every year, every 2 years. I think is wild. So you could see she's committed, enthusiastic about research, but she doesn't want to be involved in the system. She talks about the system, which later she says are these sort of neoliberal universities that evaluate and have standards and have requirements about how you do research, what research you do, and how much you should do. And she goes on. She says, I think is wild. It's like you have to produce a lot of research to show it's like I'm doing this research. So why should you be doing that? Yeah. Like in line 9, no, I want to do research to impact the local community. That's what she wants to do. She wants her research to impact the local community, to impact the teachers not with the pressure of publishing and showing off research, right? She says that's just showing off. Yeah, I published something, I published 10 articles, I published 5 articles because the university says I must. She doesn't want to get involved in that. She wants to do research that impacts her local community. I mean, nobody problematizes that, she says. Like, is publishing for the sake of publishing? And I think this is what the system is doing. She's anti that system that is measurable, that measures, evaluates, that is, that accounts for all the things that you do, and then, measures you up against the standards that are required. She says, like, the teachers should get publications very frequently. Otherwise, they are not like respected scholars. Is that okay? And sometimes I see the education like going around just publishing for having respect. And that scares me. She doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to have respect because you're publishing lots. She says, because I'm scared of doing research for the sake of the publication, not because you want to improve a situation or because you want to understand a practice. So she wants to do research to improve the teaching, to improve the teaching practice. That is her desire. You can feel the emotion in the story that she's telling. She wants to have some sort of impact, all right? So if you have a look at this diagram, it's like you've got this academic, what I've called here in this article, at the bottom, you can see the reference, academic institutional research. This is the type of research that she's referring to. And I'll go into more detail. This is the characteristics. I'll talk about it. And on this side, you've got teacher research over here. And in the middle, there's this identity dilemma that Anna is stuck in the middle. Let me just go through these 3 sections to end off. So here, the academic institutional research, the characteristics of this is the neoliberal system that she keeps referring to, where there's high accountability, where there's, you have to maintain standards that the university or that the institution sets for you. And these are measured. These are measured. The types of research you do, high impact factor journals, for example, the frequency of publications, the quantity, how many. And she finds this research meaningless. This is a word she used. This is meaningless research as far as she is concerned. On the other hand, she wants to do teacher research, which is related directly to the teacher education program that she is involved in, working with teachers, working with student teachers in the local community. And this type of research has impact. Yes, you can publish, you can you can do conference presentations, but it's got to be focused on understanding practice, her students' practice, her teachers' practice, and to improve practice. She wants to see it as being relevant, not just the sake for publishing. And she talks about this as meaningful research, right? To her, it's meaningful. To her community, it's meaningful. So she's very much in an identity dilemma here, because we saw her desired goals of getting a full-time job in a university. But if she gets that full-time job, what's going to happen is she's going to be stuck in the system that she doesn't want to be stuck in. So at this stage of her career, this is why she's in this dilemma, because she's at this particular stage in her career where she wants to move to a different type of position. She's got her past experience that she draws on, but it's not good enough according to the system. She has her desires, but they're blockages, they're conflicts that won't let her achieve her desires. She has this imagined future for herself, but what's preventing her from achieving this imagined future is not only the system, but her very strong moral stance. She knows what she wants. She knows what's right for her and her community and her teachers. And she knows what she wants to achieve, and she's determined to achieve that. So there's this tension going that way, and there's a tension that's going the other way as well. So, Anna, in terms of her researcher identity, is in this push and pull, this tug of war situation, where her identity is being questioned. So just to end then, we've been talking a lot about identity and the trends today. We've looked at we started off looking at learner identity. We moved to teacher identity, then teacher educator identity. We've looked at the story of Anna, and we've seen that when we look at identity, it's not straightforward. There are a lot of questions, there are a lot of problems, there are a lot of conflicts, and these are big questions that are always contextualized. They're always related to people in different spaces at different points in time, going right back to what I said at the beginning. So just my final word is that in the different things I've been saying today, I'm hoping that you are able to take bits and pieces and relate it to who you are, your own identity, and to your particular context where you work, with the people you work, and try and make sense of it, you know, both locally in terms of what you do and where you work, but also in terms of the bigger picture, what you are aware of from the much bigger picture. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Indeed, before I express my vote of thanks to our professor, I would like to open the floor for the participants. If you have any sort of queries, please feel free to ask.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So I'd like to have, some of the remarks on that. So wonderful presentation. I really like the way you presented on basically with the ideas of that teacher identity and the activities that you shared that are the part of your book you have recently published. So I feel like that is really very wonderful way. When I'm just observing, like I felt like when we talk about teacher identity, it is largely guided by the learner's identity as well. So as you talked about the tug of war kind of relationship that in Anna's story, being a researcher or not being a researcher, or being a teacher here and there, right, like that. So I felt like in the same note, the identity of a teacher is also gets affected by the identity of a learner. When I talk about my classes, the group of learners we have and the varieties of the classes that we need to deal here in Nepal, when we talk about, like, I have to deal with the students from management, I have to deal with the students from education, I need to do with the students from science background. So my identity in these three instances need to be fluctuated. So the same move of a teacher felt like gets affected by the teacher's identity and affected by learner's identity. How far do you relate with this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. You know, identities are relational. I mean, they have to do with the relationships we have, you know, small scale and also big scale relationships. So, and the identities change. So when you're working in your classroom and you're working with your learners, you are projecting and you're co-constructing with them one type of relationship, and then you move out of the classroom, go working with your management hat on. You're still a teacher, you're still an educator, but you have your identity shifts a little bit because you are interacting with other people in the workplace. It is sort of more institutional identity. And then, so your identities are constantly fluid, are constantly changing. And in those different settings, from the school to the classroom to you go to a conference here, we're interacting in this way. Again, we display different aspects of our identities, not only because of who I am as Gary, but because of who I'm interacting with, even though it's virtually right here. So you are 1000% right that whoever we are interacting with at the time, we display, we construct, we show our identities, but it's it's the people we're interacting with who are contributing to that co-construction of the identities in that place. No, that's right. I mean, that's right. But at the same time, in doing those identities, there's certain parts of me that I bring in, it's sort of part of my non-professional identity that I do carry around with me as well, that are text, which are pretty constant in some ways. So yeah, so that that's a good point. It's a nice theoretical point. But I think the point I was trying to make from the beginning, right at the beginning, is that some of the, I mean, I was showing you Anna's story, which is a nice example that I think we can relate to in our own workplaces. I mean, our experience as a researcher and wanting to develop teacher researcher identity will not be the same as hers, because you know she's a different person in a different context. So, but I'm just hoping that through that example we may be able to, you know, pick off bits and pieces and say, you know, that's like me, that's not like me, I could do that, I couldn't do that. Some people would think, well, she should, you know, she should just give up and go to university if that's what she wants, and just you know, publish the sorts of research that the university wants if she really wants that job. But Anna's very strong, she doesn't want to do that. So you know, we have different opinions about what you should and shouldn't do, and that could be a lovely sort of you know, a nice case to discuss in a teacher education class, for example. What should Anna do? That would be a great activity for class, for a teacher education class.
Other friends, if you have any question, please.
I'm sure it's time up.
Yes, there is a question, sir. Helen Stormer.
Okay.
Do you consider other social identities of teachers? Yes.
I'm not quite sure I understand that. Do you consider other social identities of teachers and how they negotiate them in the teaching? Yeah, I mean, I think if you mean other social identities, I don't know if you saw that diagram I had with these sort of, you know, different categories. So if you mean things like gender identity, for example, in that book, which I just happen to have next to me, this one, you know, Reflections on Language Teacher Identity Research. There's a very nice chapter in here by Stephanie Van Rijk, who looks at gender identity in the classroom. So this is about teacher identity, but she looks at the way that teacher identity intersects with gender identity. And in the book, they look at different, you know, sort of possible research topics. And, you know, they're fascinating questions one could ask about, you know, gender and teacher identity. So sort of social gender and teacher identity. You know, there are a lot of other, you know, categories sort of, traditionally we used to talk about native speaker, non-native speaker, those big fixed categories that we spoke about, which we don't speak about so much anymore. But those were, you know, categories that used to be discussed for many years in relation to teacher identity, and have been, you know, rightly criticized and problematized over the past, you know, couple of decades. So yes, those types of social categories, linguistic, national categories, cultural categories, and so on, that relate to identity as well.
There's a question from Lee Bai as well. Can you talk about the future direction of teacher/learner identity? What further research should be done in the field?
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think I actually, yeah. So I think what's interesting is looking at there's so, yeah, okay. I think we could look at teacher identity and languages other than English. I mean, there's a lot of research that focuses on English. I think there is a lot of teacher identity research from different parts of the world, although it does tend to still focus on English. I think there is more and more work coming out on teacher identity and multilingualism, but I think there's more that could be done on that. I think some interesting work has come out on looking at teacher identity and materiality. So how, when we look at teachers interacting not only in the classroom with learners and other people, but looking at teachers interacting with things and objects, and not only in the classroom, but in the digital world, and spaces as well. So I think looking at material interactions with teachers and teachers' lives, and also with learners in those spaces, of course. So yeah, I think those are interesting topics. I think more and more the conceptualization of teacher identity has been tackled recently, but there's still work on that. One of the conclusions often is that perhaps we shouldn't try and define what teacher identity means, and that's probably quite a good thing, because once you start to try and define it, it just opens up more questions, and then it becomes not relevant to certain people in certain contexts. So I think to continue questioning the conceptualization of teacher identity is another interesting research field, and we can question it by doing empirical work, I think. So those are some topics. I think also looking at teacher identity working with young learners. So it's often university or sometimes secondary school, sometimes immigrant groups and so on. But I think working with young learners, elementary schools, early career workers and so on, I think would be interesting. There are a few studies looking at younger learners in interaction with teachers and how that relates to development of teacher identity. So those are quite good topics.
So Lauren has asked a question here. Here in the United States of America, in the K-12 setting, we are being challenged by students, lack of motivation and behavior problem. I'm interested in exploring students' self-identity, perhaps sense of belonging, and how. Yes, okay, I've just missed it.
Okay, it's okay. I can read it. Okay. No, I think I don't think it's too much of a psychological study which gets to your question. I mean, there's a lot of work. If you look at Sarah Mercer's work on language teaching and psychology, she looks at well-being in the classroom, and she has a very broad conceptualization of psychology when she looks at language teaching and learning, which is quite a nice one. So she, if you just Google Sarah Mercer, M-E-R-C-E-R, she's got some great publications on the psychology of language learning and teaching, and you can have a look at her definitions of psychology in our field. They're much broader. They have a much more interrelated social connection to what she means by psychology. But she looks at well-being, and she's got a book out with Zoltan Dornier on looking at motivation, which I think you will find quite interesting. It sort of moves away from the more, I guess, strictly psychological conceptualizations of motivation. So that you could find interesting.
So thank you, Professor. You shared the valued ideas on communicating identities in classroom and exploring identities through narratives. Here, you shared about how a person understands his or her relationship with the world and how the relationship is constructed. Where when it invests in language learning, and as you said, the investing in language learning means investing in language identity. And you also said about exploring the challenges in changes in identity in classroom and projecting identities, recognizing identity, imagining identities. There's 4 ways you said. And I will have just one query at the end, that reflecting identities is a part of transformation or what? This I'll be asking. And again, you shared about identity categories and resources, then creating identity as a researcher. this is most valued for we as a researcher as well. And finally, you concluded with the identity maybe in dilemma in different stages. For example, in a stage of career, past experience, desires, imagined future, and moral stances as well. And you concluded with saying that we need to create the identity as a researcher, as a teacher, and even as a learner as well. I would like to thank Professor Gary for his remarkable presentation. We learned a lot of ideas from it. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much indeed.